Milan ou Tripoli, Vilnius ou Benghazi, Paris, Moscou, on fait le bunga, bunga. Bangkok ou Bogota, Le Caire ou Jakarta, Gustavia, on fait le bunga, bunga. Stockholm ou Monaco, ou Montevideo, Oslo, Tokyo, on fait le bunga, bunga.
Hey there, welcome to BungaCast, the global politics podcast at the end of history. My name is Alex Hochuli in São Paulo, Brazil. Indonesia is the biggest country that no one talks about. It's the world's fourth largest country by population. It's in the top 10 economies by purchasing power parity. And on the 14th of February, Indonesia, the world's third largest democracy, will stage the world's biggest single-day general election. So what do we need to know? What does Indonesia represent? Well, regular listeners will know that Indonesia's elites led a mass anti-communist purge in 1965 that saw 1 million people slaughtered. You can hear more about that in episode 121, where we interviewed Vincent Bevins about his book on the matter. Now, those massacres put an end to what was at the time the third largest communist party in the world, and the largest one that wasn't in power. This event put an end to any socialist and left-wing hopes in Indonesia. So what does a country without a left look like? What sort of ideas fill that void? Today, our guest, Vedi Hadiz, will tell us about Suharto's authoritarian new order that ran the country until 1998, and the democracy that followed, and the oligarchy that still controls things, as well as the Islamic movements that are able to channel some social grievances. What does politics look like when elections see populists face off against each other, but in a situation in which all these populists just represent different wings of the oligarchy? Here's me speaking to Vedi Hadiz. All right, hello everyone. I'm delighted to be here with Vedi Hadiz, one of the foremost scholars of Indonesian politics and political economy, who was also a student activist during the Suharto years in Indonesia, and is now the director and professor of Asian Studies at the Asia Institute at the University of Melbourne. Hi, Vedi. Welcome.
Hi, how are you?
I'm very well. How are you?
It's not very often that I'm speaking to somebody based in Brazil, to be honest, being an Asia specialist.
Yeah, well, yeah, and we managed to find a time zone which kind of worked in both Melbourne and São Paulo, so that was good. My evening and your morning. So listeners will have been long-time listeners to this podcast will be a bit familiar, I think, with the mass anti-communist purge of the mid-'60s, which we discussed in an episode a few years back. So I wanted to maybe pick up the story before we work towards discussing this year's elections and various issues about Islamic politics, about populism, to pick up the story from 1966 onwards. If you could just briefly describe what the new order was.
All right. Well, after 1966, the new order was established basically on the basis of a coalition of the military, some elements of the salaried middle class, and also Islamic social organizations. So these were some of the forces that felt that their interests had been threatened by the political and economic policies of the previous Sukarno regime. Now, the middle class was in particular prone to supporting the military because of high inflation during the late old order, which caused their salaries to plummet in value. Now, so the basis of the new order is that's a kind of authoritarian developmentalism, and its legitimacy really was based on its ability to deliver economic development. And it did maintain high rates of economic growth for most of its tenure, that is from 1966 to 1998. But corruption, abuse of power, and non-transparent kinds of practices made sure that economic and political power became centered onto something that I've called in previous writings an oligarchy, which consisted of an alliance between the big business and the upper echelons of the politico-bureaucratic apparatus and the military. And this oligarchy benefited the most from the new order's authoritarian developmentalism, although, a large middle class, or a fairly large middle class, came to develop as well, and poverty rates fell, etc. But that legitimacy was undermined severely by the Asian economic crisis of 1997-98, where it was shown that the underpinnings of New Order economic development were actually quite fragile, based on easy access to foreign capital markets, foreign investment, and also monopolistic practices internally, which favored cronies of the regime. So basically, Indonesia was the worst performing of the Asian economies that were hit by the Asian economic crisis 97-98. The oligarchy therefore splintered, abandoned Suharto, and provided room for a mass-based movement to develop, because the people were suffering from this all the way, for the first time, all the way from business down to the middle class, all the way down to the working class and the peasantry, and so on. So there was something that unified them for a brief period of time, and that was to remove Suharto. Finally, with internal pressure and also pressure from overseas, actually, the IMF, the Americans, and so on, who lost faith in Suharto, who they had been propping up for 30 years. He resigned in May 1998, which heralded the start of what we call reformasi in Indonesia, which is the democratization period. And it's been a heralded democratization process globally. It's considered to be a democratization success story relative to many others. But I also like to point out that it's been a very, very flawed democracy. The first issue that I have, which I'm constantly banging on about to everybody's annoyance, is that the oligarchy has survived the end of the authoritarian regime and merely reconstituted in a democratic format by actually colonizing the political parties, parliaments, and other institutions of democratic rule. So basically, all the major political parties are dominated by oligarchic interests whose origins you can trace to the New Order. And therefore,
these oligarchs are drawn from, is it from the military? Is it the big bourgeoisie? If it's the big bourgeoisie, is it manufacturing, extractive? Where do they come from?
It's again mainly an alliance between the big bourgeoisie and the upper echelons of the politico-bureaucratic infrastructure, with the military sort of relegated to a semi-junior partner for some time now, but recently and from time to time actually showing signs of wanting to get into the act a bit more strongly than they have. Now, mind you, the military's sort of formal representation within parliament and so on, that's gone. But former military officers representing the institutional interests of the military permeate through the political parties. And secondly, they also permeate through state-owned companies and various other institutions. And the other thing is that the access economically and politically of the military in the Indonesian political economy has become decentralized, in that you will have local military commands developing, sort of local oligarchic kinds of alliances at the local level with local businesses, local politicos, local bureaucrats, and so on. So this oligarchy, I think, remains really significant, and it's made sure that the driving force of Indonesian democracy really is is the practice of rapacious corruption, in that democratic politics really is there to determine which faction of the oligarchy, and these are not factions which are set in stone, they're very fluid, they just change according to contingency, has the closest access to the levers of economic and political power, to public resources and institutions for the purposes of private accumulation. And that is actually, I think, one of the main, I think the main problem with Indonesian democracy. And that has spilled over really to things like, sort of the relegation of matters like human rights and broader democratic rights, freedom of the press, and so on, to the background, especially lately. Ironically, under a president who in 2014, was first elected, now at the end of his second term, as a reformer, because he was this fellow known as Jokowi, Joko Widodo is his full name, is considered to be, having been outside of the New Order oligarchy. I mean, he's young enough not to have been at the center of the New Order. So people thought that he'd be a reformer. He came from, small business origins. But frankly, I was always skeptical of that story, because he could never have been catapulted onto the national stage without the financial and political support of oligarchic interests. And so he has been, and it has been shown over his tenure that this has been the case, and he has not been the reformer that he was made out to be.
So I just wanted to maybe just to wind back a little bit, just in political economic terms, how transformative were the years under the New Order in terms of its developmentalist regime? I mean, was it based on driving exports around the resource extraction, encouraging domestic manufacturing, and how much did that change the landscape of Indonesian society over those years?
Well, there were different phases of the New Order. The first phase, I would say, was 1966 to 1973, where economic development was basically based on bringing in as much foreign investment and foreign aid as possible. Remember, this was during the Vietnam War, during the height of the so-called Cold War, which was never particularly cold in my part of Asia. If you know what I mean. I mean, I don't think that the Vietnamese would have experienced the Cold War as not being particularly heated, nor the Koreans, and so forth.
Indeed.
So anyway, so the West was quite happy that a sort of a military dominated at first regime that was pro-Western and had a developmentalist inclination came to power after the demise of the old Sukarno regime, which had been very close to the Indonesian Communist Party, by the way, which had been the third largest communist party in the world in the mid-1960s. So they were very happy about that. And of course, they're quite happy to provide the foreign aid and the foreign investment. So that was 66 to 73. 73, an event occurred on the other side of Asia, and that was the Yom Kippur War, And as you know, many of your listeners would know, some would remember, depending on what their ages are, that OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, of which Indonesia was a member then, hiked up oil prices, which caused sort of energy crisis, but resulted in an oil boom for Indonesia. So there were windfall oil profits that the state controlled, right? And this was the basis for a lot of the more monopolistic, oligopolistic sort of policies that developed, which was catered towards developing a domestic bourgeoisie. But this domestic bourgeoisie would be extremely cronyistic and would have none of the progressive sort of political connotations that often linked to it in European history of the 18th or 19th centuries. So this was a very closely intertwined bourgeoisie, which became an element of that developing oligarchy that I mentioned. Now, the sort of variety, I suppose, in Indonesia is that that big bourgeoisie was mainly ethnic Chinese.
Yeah, right.
And there's a historical reason for that, in that the ethnic Chinese, because of colonial policy under Dutch colonialism before Indonesian independence, occupied the position of middlemen, really, between the agricultural economy and the more modern economy controlled by Dutch capitalism, colonial capitalism. And they were basically best placed in terms of their regional and international sort of trade networks, access to, money, and sort of also domestic trading networks amongst themselves, to be the basis of that big bourgeoisie to be developed by the New Order, and in which political bureaucrats really became partners, simply because they had the ability to make laws, to make regulations, and enforce or not enforce them. And therefore, you also had an element of the bourgeoisie, which was a smaller one, that came out of the political bureaucracy itself. In fact, from political bureaucratic families, most especially the family of President Suharto himself, which developed alliances with many of these big Chinese, ethnic Chinese conglomerates. But the point I would make here is that it suited the New Order very well to have this situation, because the ethnic Chinese business, section would never pose a political threat, because they were a minority and they were dependent on the protection of the state. And there was a lot of, some of it actually cultivated by the state, animosity towards ethnic Chinese in general. Of course, these hostilities, animosities, some of it go back to the colonial period, but a lot of this was nurtured and cultivated by the New Order. For example, it did not allow the teaching of the Chinese language. It did not allow print material in Chinese script. All of these things, made it look like, well, it was protecting the people, against ethnic Chinese business, whereas actually the political bureaucrats, the big families, were in cahoots. But so basically, you had a situation where a big business, because of its ethnic makeup and also because of the structure of power, that dependence on state patronage and all that, was often subservient to the wishes of the political bureaucrats, especially the Suharto family itself, because it needed its protection.
Right.
Now, the third phase took place in the early 1980s, when international oil prices fell, And then Indonesia underwent a period in which it pursued export-oriented industrialization on the basis of cheap labor, export-oriented cheap labor, garments, textiles, footwear, that sort of thing, bringing in investment from Korea and Taiwan and so on, and this actually became a major pillar of the economy in terms of sort of exports until 1997, 1998. But together with that, throughout that period in the 80s and 90s, there was a neoliberalization process whereby access to financial markets became easier. There was a liberalization of the banking sector, the stock market, etc. All of these basically providing cheap money really to the big conglomerates and the families connected to them, and therefore making them even bigger, right? But as we saw in after 97, 98, a lot of these were fragile because they had accumulated lots of foreign debt. And the foreign debtors had thought, well, it's fine to give them lots of money because, well, the Suharto family is behind them, and there's this big authoritarian structure that will make sure that all this doesn't collapse. But it does collapse, which caused a lot of problems. And at the end, the state had to bail them out, the democratic state in 99, 2000, and so on. And a lot of these big businesses have gotten away with not paying off their debts and buying back their companies at fire sale prices. And basically, they've a lot of them, they were certainly damaged, but many of them survived that crisis to be dominant again in the democratic period.
Yes.
Sorry,
so
was I too
again a story
detailed there? I'm sorry.
But no, it's fine. I mean, it's I guess another way of illustrating the persistence of the oligarchy in Indonesia, and indeed maybe even the absence of a left after the experience of murderous anti-communism in the middle part of the century. But we'll come back maybe to that. One last kind of element of backdrop, which on an ideological question, particularly kind of the state ideology of Pancasila. And I mean, I'm not very familiar with it. I encountered it probably for the first time, as I suspect many listeners did, in Joshua Oppenheimer's 2012 film, The Act of Killing, in which you see this featured in that film, the youth wing, the Pancasila youth with their orange camouflage fatigues and whatever. I mean, that's where I first encountered it. If you could just briefly explain what this official ideology was and indeed continues to be.
Okay, well, I mean, it has a history in that in 1945, Sukarno invented it as a way of placating two different wings of the Indonesian nationalist movement's elites. One tended towards the establishment of a secular nationalist state. The other one tended towards the establishment of a state that was more based on Islamic precepts. Okay? And Sukarno basically invented Pancasila as a way of avoiding conflict between these two groups, because it does have, number one, Pancasila means 5 principles, by the way. And the first principle is belief in one God. So that placates the Muslims, right? And the third principle is Indonesian national unity, which placates the nationalists. Then you've got the fifth principle, which is social justice for all, which placates both, right? I mean, so in a way, it was a rather, genius move. But Pancasila has lived a long, circuitous life, and the thing is, I don't want to use jargon, but in many ways, it's a bloody empty signifier. You can put anything in it.
Okay.
You can put anything in it, and what Suharto did during the New Order is that he codified it in a statist, nationalist, authoritarian, developmentalist sort of mold, right? And so the meaning and practice of Pancasila became much more, maybe, uh, you know, towards the direction of state and society unified in such a way that really society should not rebel against the state,
Right.
because we have one common interest, sort of organic status sort of idea, and it sort of became very, very culturalist in that it posited that there was an authentic Indonesian culture. Which is very difficult to sort of, fabricate in that, it's a very, very culturally diverse archipelago of thousands of islands with hundreds of ethnic groups. But there was this whole science of Pancasila, pseudoscience, made
Right.
up during that period, which everybody in school, including myself, had to consume. And I must say that it has had an effect on generations of Indonesians,
Right.
and the thinking and the
And
view of
enforcing
the
some sort
world.
of conformity as well.
That's right. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So it became a way of inculcating conformity and obedience, and really the highest value really is that of harmony, and therefore that is supposed to be conflictual to liberal ideas of competition and leftist ideas of class conflict.
Right. Right.
Okay, so that's the important bit about
Hmm.
Pancasila,
So, I mean,
which, by the way, is still the state ideology.
right, right. And I mean,
Mm,
switching tack slightly, but remaining kind of within ideological questions. I mean, I think one of the few ways I think that Indonesia has featured in often really dumb Western mainstream media discussion over the past 2 decades, at least this is my impression, was particularly with Western concern over radical Islam and how Indonesia supposedly provided potentially a model for other countries in being more moderate and so on. I don't want to dwell on that portrayal of things, but
mm,
you have written about an Islamization of Indonesian society over the past decades. And I wonder if you
mm.
could describe what that looks like and indeed maybe account for why that's happened.
Well, in the first instance, the sort of Islamization of Indonesian society is linked to a global process within the Islamic world. Such a process occurred from North Africa to the Middle East to South Asia to Southeast Asia from the 70s and the 80s, you know, spurred to some extent by the fact that there was oil money to be spent in the Middle East in providing new educational, religiously oriented institutions for people from other parts of the world to go study. Lots of Indonesians went to study in the Gulf states in the 70s and 80s and 90s, and they brought with them an understanding of Islam that was more orthodox, in the sense that it was it came to displace really many of the elements of what you might call folk Islam in Indonesia, which
Mm,
actually is, historically has been predominant in different parts of Indonesia. I mean, the most well known is the sort of syncretic Javanism of Central Java, in which you have sort of traditional folk religions mixed up with Hindu, Buddhist ideas, and Islamic, including Sufistic ideas,
right.
being displaced by more uh, orthodox, more rigidly codified understandings. So that is one element of the story. But the second element of the story is that, I said that, certain Islamic organizations did follow the military in overthrowing Sukarno and in crushing the left in Indonesia. But as soon as the new order came into power, they were basically cast aside by the new order, and there was a very simple reason for that. With the sort of with the destruction of the left, particularly the Indonesian Communist Party, and the historical weakness of liberalism in Indonesia, which was only, you could only find it really amongst the intelligentsia of the, at that time still relatively small urban population. It was only Islam that had the capacity to have a grassroots base. And the new order was premised on the ability to demobilize social movements at the grassroots.
So, any social movement,
any at all, that could pose a threat to the existing order. So the Muslims got to be, actually took the brunt of state repression throughout the mid and late 70s throughout the 80s. And as a result, you had many different kinds of splinter Islamic groups. In Indonesia, you've got the Muhammadiyah and the Nahdlatul Ulama, which are the basic mainstream organizations. They go all the way back to the colonial period. They're fairly, flexible. They can basically work with anybody in power, because they need state patronage in order to survive. Okay, and that's basically the reason. But then you get all of these younger people who get discontented and disgruntled. And by the way, there was also a kind of separatist Darul Islamist movement between 1949 and 1962 in Indonesia, which was crushed in 1962. They were the descendants of the people who wanted more of an Islamic-oriented state. Yeah. Now these guys, though, were mobilized in the fight against the Communist Party in 65, 66. Right. They were crushed in 62, 65, 66. They were mobilized by the same people who had crushed them.
Right. So they expected. They were on the other side of the bayonet for a bit, and then moved on to the other. Yeah,
that's right. So after that, they expected to be, to enjoy parts of the spoils of power, right? But then they were cast aside as well, and a lot of these groups, that then formed organizations. By the way, some of which, you can say definitively were cultivated by military intelligence itself. Just to give the new order the pretense, or the justification to be authoritarian, or save ourselves, save the country from these Islamic radicals, which they cultivated themselves in some way.
Yeah.
But after having been cultivated, then they developed their own, roots, and this was. These were the origins of what became known as the Jamaah Islamiyah, linked to Al Qaeda, right? Mm-hmm. So it's like Al Qaeda having come out of, or the Taliban having come out of U.S. patronage and then coming to bite the U.S.'s ass.
Wow, yeah. How could you imagine? Yeah,
yeah, and it's happened in sort of the same way in a smaller scale in Indonesia, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they became.
If I could ask, the character of Islamic politics or Islamic infused politics in Indonesia today, does it have that kind of radical character, or can be characterized as political Islam, or how would you describe it?
Indonesian Islam is, unlike, let's say, Malaysian Islam, very heterogeneous. I don't want to simplify Malaysian Islam. That there are varieties there as well. Okay, but we're not talking about Malaysia now. But Indonesia is much more. There's a greater variety of kinds of Islamic propensities, whether culturally or politically, in Indonesia, partly because Dutch colonial state, really, unlike the British in Malaysia, did not try to impose a kind of policy of uniformizing these Islamic
Right.
forces, right? So, so answer to your question, I mean, there are elements of Indonesian Islam that have a radical bent, but there are others, like Muhammadiyah and Nahdlatul Ulama, which actually are the organizations that give Indonesia the reputation of being a champion of moderate Islam, because they will basically accommodate anybody who's in power, right? And don't really want to rock the boat. Now, but some of these radicals also are very different. I mean, you've got some people who are outright terrorists, right? And a lot of these are in jail now. A lot of these are, sort of splintered and further down underground more than they've ever been. There are also people you might call radical, but they want to but they don't actually use the sort of violent, bombing and so on that strategies associated with the Jamaah Islamiyah and those kinds of organizations. People like the Indonesian Islamic Defenders Front, which now is called something else. I mean, they basically, what they do is they mobilize people in the streets. They also have connections with organized crime, at the street level. So we're able to mobilize, sort of street level infrastructures of sort of distribution of social largesse, at a very small scale, and they organize public demonstrations for or against particular candidates and so on during elections and so on. And then you've got other people who say, well, okay, we're okay with democracy, but we'd like a bit more of an Islamic flavor in it. Yeah.
So how
there
does
are
that?
varieties of it. Yeah.
I wonder how that then fits with something that you've written about, this notion of Islamic populism in Indonesia, which, as I've understood it, to an extent, in the absence of a left, can act as somewhat of a vehicle for the voicing of grievances or claims about social justice, but in a much more, but not for outright contestation, I guess, to put it that way. Is that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, Islamic populism, first of all, is not a phenomenon which is only found in Indonesia. I think it's found across Muslim societies where leftist articulations of grievances, or even liberal ones, are not possible. And therefore, logically, people go to avenues that are ideologically and logistically possible, right? And there is enough sources within Islamic political traditions, whether you follow the jurisprudence or not, but certainly political traditions that actually voice aspirations of social equality, egalitarianism, social justice, and so on. And this is what a lot of Islamic organizations try to portray themselves as being a representative of, sort of articulating these grievances which otherwise would not be articulated through other avenues. But even within this thing that I call Islamic populism, there are different kinds of varieties, because basically it is a tendency that is a reaction. It's a reaction to things, right? And it's a reaction to a world order, an Indonesian social order, which is increasingly unequal socially, and even within a democracy, has not stopped the sort of the accumulation of wealth within a small group of people, has blocked the upward social mobility of more devout people in the middle class who have all these dreams of going up the social ladder, and have been blocked by the structure of capitalism, which makes that really difficult. And they go to Islam to do that.
Right. Right.
But they can do that in ways that are that are nu- that are numerous in their variety. In that there are, for example, sort of Muslim politicians who articulate a populist sort of stance where they say, well, the state has to pay more attention to the majority. By the majority, they mean the Muslim majority, to the poor, and the majority of the poor are Muslim, right? But by the religion on their identity card. But they will also support the neoliberal economic policies. And you do have neoliberal populism in Brazil and
Yeah.
other places, right? So it's not, something that is unheard of. It's just the ideological content is different. But then you have other people who go, well, what we needed is an Islamic state, right?
Yeah.
And these are the people at the margins of that tendency of Islamic populism, because they have, unless they're being cultivated by Indonesian intelligence agencies, really have no access to power. And there are people that are somewhere in the middle, who are brokers. Really, they broker the street gangs and so on, and the politicians and businesses, and they basically sell the
Right.
grievances articulated by Islamic populism. And the result is, okay, candidates and so on that are supported may win, but the vast majority of people don't get anything out of it, but the brokers do.
Right. And I mean, does this mean that Indonesian politics is quite identitarian or broken down into identitarian lines, or is it maybe asymmetrical in that regard, that you have
I
this?
think it's asymmetrical, because one of the things I say about populism, not just Islamic populism. What I say about populism is that it is an asymmetrical multi-class alliance. That's what I think of populism everywhere, and there are different elements of that alliance that dominate depending on the context
Yeah.
and the social histories of the different societies. Now, Indonesia has also has got nationalist, populist kinds of traditions, but in terms of Indonesian Islamic populism, it is dominated mainly by this sort of aspiring, a more educated middle class, whose aspirations, of social mobility and so on, are not quite fulfilled, in spite of having been educated, and having the skills that they think that they have. But see, the difference with Turkey, for example, is that there is no big Islamic business class.
Right.
So
So
they
there's
cannot.
no equivalent to the AKP or something like
There
that,
is
which.
no equivalent to the AKP. The PKS, which people often, compare to the AKP, has no money. In that I've researched their economic base, and their economic, sort of supporters are really small business people, unlike the AKP, who after the neoliberalization in the 80s became big, provincially based bourgeoisie that became the financial basis for the rise of the AKP. You don't have that in Indonesia. So what? And you don't have something in Egypt either, where you have a strong Muslim Brotherhood who are able to sort of distribute largesse, through clinics and social welfare policies to the urban and rural poor. And so what you have in Indonesia really is an Islamic populism stuck in its middle class shell, right? Has got no links upwards, and therefore hasn't got the financial capacity to make the links downward, by
Right.
providing these social welfare policies and so on. And therefore, they become really a force only in two senses. One, incidentally, and that is when they are needed for the purposes of intra-oligarchy conflict. And secondly, from the point of view that their rhetoric, which is moralistic, and that moralism is connected to their ideas of social justice and so on, is mainstreamed. And that's important. So even parties that are nationalist, in their sort of outlook and so on, have taken up a lot of the moralistic kinds of ideas that come out of this Islamic populist stream. So in some ways, if I was going to say, the sort of analogy would be how in the West, fringe right-wing ideas have become mainstreamed by the sort of mainstream right-wing parties,
Yeah, yeah,
and therefore the center of politics has moved to the right.
yeah. I mean,
Okay, so
that's
without being in power, the Islamic populists, and it's really difficult for Islamic populists to be in power in Indonesia, unlike in Turkey. But so without being in power, they do exert an influence, nevertheless. Yeah.
that's very interesting. And I'm conscious of the time, so I think moving
Oh,
forward
sorry,
to kind
I'm
of
yapping on, aren't I? Sorry.
no, not at all. No, it's all good stuff. So I want to try to get as much good stuff in there. Talking about looking at this election, and we don't need to dwell too much on the kind of ins and outs or prognoses or anything like that, but thinking a little bit about maybe what Indonesian elections have been 2014, 2019, and then now this year again. You've described recent elections as a confrontation between varying populisms. And in that regard, it does seem to echo a little bit of what's going on in kind of Western European politics, or even North American politics for that matter as well. So maybe you could sketch out for us what that means, and maybe talk us through kind of the main candidates and how they fit into that story.
Okay, I think that the first thing that I would like to say is that unlike many of my other colleagues who write about Indonesian politics, I do not adhere to the idea that there has been a sharp polarization in Indonesia between secular nationalists and Islamists. Okay?
Hmm.
What I suggest instead is that secular nationalist forms of populism and Islamic forms of populism are cultural resource pools that can be adopted and adjusted as necessary by any of the competing oligarchic factions.
Hmm.
So none of these fights are ideological in nature fundamentally, but they take on this ideological kind of sort of superficial, appearance because of the rhetoric that needs to be adopted and employed to mobilize people, to support particular kinds of
Hmm.
candidates. And you always have to talk about employment, social justice, these sorts of things which, uh, people worry about in their everyday lives. And the sort of language, a political language that is available to do that is actually available from Indonesian secular nationalist populist traditions as well as Islamic ones. And therefore you find candidates right now who while they might, sort of originate from networks, social, economic, and political networks that you can identify more as being nationalist or Islamist, they will combine these whenever, however necessary, however is useful.
Hmm. Yeah.
So, for example, one of the candidates right now, the front runner in 2014 and 2019, used a lot of Islamic populist sort of sentiment and so on. But one of his opponents has more legitimacy amongst this community, and now he's veered more towards nationalist jargon. And it's entirely, to me, unsurprising, because the fight is not ideological. It's not about particular programs. It's not about particular policies. It's not even about particular representations of class coalitions. It's about which parts of the oligarchy, as they are constituted now in factions, which can change at any time, will have the greater, closer access to state resources and institutions for the purposes of private accumulation. That's all it is.
So there's no popular component whatsoever in this election in any significant way. I don't even want to say necessarily like
Not in any
working class or
substantial.
yeah.
Well, there is a Labour Party that has been established, and I'd like to see it do well, but it is also fragmented between those who want to support the Islamist candidate, not the Islamist, but the candidate who is more associated with Islamist networks, one that wants to connect with one of the two that are more connected to sort of state nationalist networks. And there are those who say, screw them all, none of them are pro-Labour. And this is the minority in that party,
Right.
right?
Right.
So as much as, it'd be nice to have a Labour Party represented in Parliament, however that Labour Party looks like, it's not going to be a main player in the fight. In terms of social organizations, mass organizations that actually have an infrastructure, that actually have finances, that actually have organizational capacity, they are linked one way or another, or have been bought one way or another by the competing oligarchic factions.
Right. And
That's
in
a
terms,
very cheerful prognosis, isn't
well, yeah, I mean,
it? Diagnosis,
you did hint that Yokoi, who broke through in 2014 as someone who was not part of the oligarchy. I mean, he came from the middle class. He did have moneyed interests behind him. It nevertheless seemed to signal that there could be some bit of light between within the kind of traditional political oligarchy, that someone else could sneak through maybe. And I guess from what you're saying is that to the extent that there was ever a bit of a window, that's completely closed now in terms of and part.
Frankly, I never thought that there was as big a window as many of my colleagues at that time thought, because it was clear that he had to cater to the interests that had put him there. And it became clear very, very quickly. And in his second term, he's been responsible for legislation that has curbed labor rights, reduced environmental scrutiny over development projects. He has presided over laws that make people vulnerable if they criticize those in power through the internet, as I'm doing now. And they've exerted pressure on universities and so on to conform. And right now they're using state facilities in the form of social assistance programs to actually cheat in the elections.
Right. And just finally, I mean, Prabowo, who's likely to win. I mean, we're recording this on Wednesday, the 7th of February, so the elections are a week away. Are things likely to get worse under him? I mean, do you see any significant change of course in any significant way?
Well, I think it can only get worse with him in power, because He was the son-in-law of Suharto. He was a New Order general with connections with, he was at the heart of the New Order. He has, strong business interests that are tied to these oligarchic networks and extractive industries and so on. And he has a horrible track record in the area of human rights.
Right. Well, a cheering note to finish on. I'd love to continue this discussion because I had a lot more to touch on. A lot more about Indonesia.
Sorry, I was yapping a bit too much.
No.
Yeah.
It only means that if you'd be willing to come on another time, so we can continue this discussion. But thank you very much.
Yeah. Okay. Well, my pleasure.